Good morning. I'm Joe Mizell. I'm the university librarian. Welcome to Brown University on this momentous double commencement weekend, and welcome in particular to the John Hay Library, which is the home of Brown University's outstanding collection of rare books, manuscripts, and archives. I'd like to begin this event this morning with the university's newly adopted land acknowledgment statement. Brown University is located in Providence, Rhode Island, on lands that are within the ancestral homelands of the Narragansett Indian tribe. We acknowledge that beginning with colonization and continuing for centuries, the Narragansett Indian tribe have been dispossessed of most of their ancestral lands in Rhode Island by the actions of individuals and institutions. We acknowledge our responsibility to understand and respond to those actions. The Narragansett Indian tribe, whose ancestors stewarded this land with great care, continues as a sovereign nation today. We commit to working together to honor our past and build our future with truth. Recognition and responsibility, truth and understanding, past injustice, and the living present. These dynamics are central to this forum about the expanded digital second edition of Brown's landmark Report of the Brown University Steering Committee on Slavery and Justice. The report, originally released in 2006, broke new ground by confronting and publicly documenting the university's complex history with the transatlantic slave trade and its legacies of inequity and injustice. The original report was not simply the outcome of a rigorous, courageous, and transformational institutional process. It was an eye-opening work of history that was also a historical event in its own right. It opened new possibilities in our society for accountability to the past and owning up to its legacies. The report's continued and evolving impact, extending well beyond higher education, is taken up in new commentary and reflections that are part of the second edition. The new edition is the result of intensive collaborative work between the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice, the library, the Office of University Communications, and the Office of the President. Brown is a leader in creating innovative born digital scholarly publications, representing the Slavery and Justice Report as an enhanced, openly accessible, immersive, and interactive digital publication allows this essential work to reach the widest possible audience. Meanwhile, readers also have the option to engage with the expanded text as a printed book. Let me add that we also developed a special digital student edition with reader tools designed for class discussion. This fall will be the third year in a row that it will be used for the college's first readings program for incoming undergraduates. And this realizes the report's recommendation to include discussion of the university's historical relationship to slavery as a normal part of freshman orientation. Let me now introduce my excellent colleague, Dr. Allison Levy, Digital Scholarship Editor at the library, who will bring us in to the second edition's enhanced digital experience. After this, Professor Anthony Bogues, Director of the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice, and Rakeem Brooks, Class of '09, President of the Alliance for Justice and AFJ Action, will conduct a conversation about the report then and now and respond to questions. Thank you for your interest in this remarkable work, and again, welcome and welcome back to Brown.
Thank you, Joe, and let me also extend a very warm welcome to all of you to the John Hay Library today. It is my great pleasure to showcase for you today the expanded digital second edition of Brown's landmark Slavery and Justice Report. The striking image before you juxtaposes Martin Puryear's Slavery Memorial, installed on the front green in 2014, against University Hall, constructed with enslaved labor in the late 18th century. This compelling re-foregrounding extends well beyond the virtual book cover. Indeed, this digital second edition represents Brown's commitment to constant evolution by offering readers an innovative, intentional, and inclusive experience. As an open access publication, it provides enduring, barrier-free access to knowledge. In other words, it's available to anyone, anywhere, at no cost. The application of universal design principles ensures equitable use by all persons, including those with disabilities. And further reflecting our commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, the display typeface chosen for the digital edition was designed by a type foundry for creatives of color. The second edition opens with a foreword by President Paxson, addressing a new and expanded readership and providing the necessary framing for the re-presentation of the report. In terms of content and organization, the report is positioned as both a scholarly one and a major historical document in its own right, complemented with the important story of how it came into being and how it transformed higher education's engagement with legacies of inequity and injustice. That interpretive narrative is told over 14 newly commissioned essays. From this interactive table of contents, readers can navigate the book in any order of their choosing. The second edition acknowledges the work of Africans and African Americans who helped build Brown University and this nation. The dedication also recognizes the scholars and educators who confront history and effect change every day. The creation of the second edition was a deeply collaborative project, and all who contributed are acknowledged here as well. Let me now bring you into the book, beginning with the report, and again with the possibility of navigating the resource in a non-linear fashion. I've selected this section, Slavery, the Slave Trade, and Brown University, to demonstrate the ways in which the digital second edition promotes deeper engagement with the historical documents contained in the original report. High-resolution, zoomable images allow readers to see details of 18th century documents that are often rendered illegible in print publications. I turn now from a view of the articles from the slave ship Sally, or the list of men who served on the ship in 1764, to this, the ship's manifest on its departure for Africa. The document includes the name of the ship's captain, Esek Hopkins, its owner, Nicholas Brown and Company, and a brief description of the ship's cargo. Readers of the digital edition can access full transcriptions of the historical documents, produced specifically for the second edition and for use by digital humanities practitioners wishing to apply interpretive tools to the historical record. And now, let me showcase a few of the essays, beginning with an interview of President Emerita Ruth Simmons by Professor Anthony Bogues. You'll find here thoughtful, inspiring remarks from Dr. Simmons about her motivations in calling for an investigation into the university's relationship to slavery and the transatlantic slave trade, the significance of the process that undergirded the investigation, and the enduring legacy of the report. A collective exploration of our history by Dean Rashid Zia introduces a set of short essays by alumni spanning a period of more than half a century at Brown. These reflections illustrate how the collective exploration of the university's history can be an act of both personal learning and public transformation. And let me here point out a second navigation system for those readers who wish to read sequentially. Relevant links are provided at the end of each essay. The final essay I'll spotlight today, by Provost Visiting Professor Renee Ader, allows me to say a few words about the library's commitment to digital preservation. Pop-up notes include updated URLs that have been archived to ensure permanent, reliable, unalterable links to the online sources cited throughout the book. This practice, among others, ensures prolonged access to the profound scholarship that comprises the second edition. I invite you to explore the digital second edition on your own, to revisit or read for the first time Brown's Slavery and Justice Report, to immerse yourself in the accompanying historical documents, and to learn from the contributors, past and present scholars at Brown, current and former university leaders, alumni, and recent graduates, all of whom have so generously contributed their expertise and insight to this remarkable second edition. Thank you. Thank you. I would now like to welcome to the podium Anthony Bogues and Rakeem Brooks. Anthony Bogues is the Asa Messer Professor of Humanities and Critical Theory, Professor of Africana Studies, and Director of the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice. He is also an affiliated faculty member of the Departments of Political Science, Modern Culture and Media, History of Art and Architecture, and the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies. He teaches courses on Africana political philosophy, cultural politics, intellectual history, contemporary critical theory, comparative literature of Africa and the African diaspora, as well as courses on the history of Haitian society and art. Among Professor Bogues' many research and writing interests are radical political thought, Caribbean and African politics, as well as Haitian, Caribbean, and African art. He was a member of the 2003 Slavery and Justice Steering Committee and one of the authors of its final report in 2006. He also played a major role in the development of the second edition. Rakeem H. Brooks is the president of Alliance for Justice and a public interest appellate lawyer. He garnered an outstanding reputation as an innovative strategist, policy thinker, and legal advocate in his previous role as campaign manager for the ACLU's Systemic Equality Campaign. Prior to his work at the ACLU, Brooks was an associate attorney at Sussman Godfrey. There, he sued opioid manufacturers, worked to free citizens incarcerated in Dallas prisons at the outset of the COVID-19 pandemic, and filed a Supreme Court amicus brief defending the right of consumers to have an independent Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Brooks recently served as a member of the Biden-Harris transition team after previously serving as a policy advisor for the Treasury Department during the Obama administration. He began his career as a C. Edwin Baker Fellow at the progressive think tank Demos, and currently serves on the advisory board for Brown's Center for Slavery and Justice, and as a board member of Getting Out, Staying Out in his native East Harlem. Brooks clerked for Justice Edwin Cameron on the Constitutional Court of South Africa and at the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit and the D.C. Circuit. He holds an A.B. from Brown University, class of '09, an M.Phil in politics from the University of Oxford, where he was a Rhodes Scholar, and a J.D. and M.B.A. from Yale Law School and the Yale School of Management. Please join me in welcoming Professor Bogues and Rakeem Brooks.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much to all of you for coming. I was a little worried, as I was saying to Joe, because there's another graduation going on, so I thought, oh, okay. That's very important, because that's what commencement is supposed to be, our graduation is supposed to be all about. I want to just say one more thing before I begin my remarks, is that I'm really deeply honored to be sitting here beside Rakeem Brooks, who was a student at Brown and whom I had a very deep privilege to teach, and who came into my first freshman seminar, which was called Race, Slavery, and Modernity. So to have Rakeem sitting here speaking after, when one thinks about that freshman seminar and his participation, is really is an honor for me, but also a pleasure as a teacher. And so thanks, Rakeem, for agreeing to do this. I begin by thanking all of the persons who worked on this project. Allison Levy, Cass Callett, Joe Mizell, and all the various contributors to the volume, as well as to the numerous library staff and the staff from the President's office. Thank you all. It was a labor of love, I think, to get this particular volume out. I want to pay special thanks to Dr. Simmons, for agreeing to have me interview her, but also for her catalytic role in organizing the commission in 2003, which then led to the report of 2006. And for those of you who are reading the volume, I would just want to point to the interview with her. I want to just briefly, in these remarks, talk about the question of history and the politics of the present, and how this particular report pushes us to confront history in two ways. The first is this. It is acknowledged that this is a pioneering report. But like all pioneering documents, there is a lacuna. In this particular instance, the lacuna was the lack of attention that the report paid to indigenous dispossession. That lacuna is now being corrected with land acknowledgement, and I want to recognize Ray, who is here, from the Native and Indigenous Initiative. And so that we are making amends, so to speak. But as pioneering as the report was, one needs to point out this particular lacuna. And it's a lacuna as well because when we think about New England, where we reside, and the settler colonialism of the period, then I think it's important to understand that the first persons who were enslaved in New England were Native Americans. That the actual slave codes of Massachusetts were not the slave codes for African slaves, but these were slave codes for Native Americans. And that these slave codes then got rearranged and reworked on with African slavery. The first Africans came here to New England in 1638 on a ship called the Desire, but also that ship carried Native Americans from here meaning New England, to the Caribbean. And in coming back from the Caribbean, had cotton, tobacco, and the so-called, as the manifest says, Negroes. So the question of dispossession, the question of racial slavery, the question of the slavery of indigenous people are all, as we know, forms of human domination. They are distinctive in some ways, but they are overlapping histories which create the foundations of this Americas. The CSSJ report, as I said, does not necessarily pay attention to this. And today we do so. And for that, I say, give thanks. My second point is an elaboration of a point made by James Baldwin, that remarkable African-American writer, and his conception that, and here I quote him, "We carry history," Jimmy says, "within us. That history," he says, "shapes us, our frames of reference, our identities, and our aspirations." History, therefore, is not about the past. This is me, not Jimmy, but a structuring element of the present. Because of this, history becomes central to politics. Why? Because a critical element of politics is the narrative, or a set of narratives about self and country. A nation is not just a conglomeration of people within some common geographical space. It is shaped by narratives about that space, about how we see ourselves, how we got there, and what is the significance and meaning of how we got there. This idea of who we are, what has been called by some writers the imagined community, is central to the idea and the narrative about the nation. Thus, history becomes not just a set of facts, a set or a series of facts, but rather becomes a narrative that structures us, that structures the ways we think in this imagined community. From this particular perspective, therefore, the current arguments around 1619, the arguments that are abound around monuments and whether should they be taken down, or who should be taken down, what should be replaced, about so-called critical race theory being taught in schools, are not cultural wars. Cultural wars, which is the name the media gives it, New York Times onwards, is really a misnomer. But these struggles and these arguments are really political ideological struggles. Political ideological struggle about what should be the dominant narrative of this imagined community. What I think, therefore, is clear is that the dominant narrative of white supremacy, which has all sorts of things in it, all sorts of elements in it, is not only just exclusionary or racist, but violently so. Let's take replacement theory and about one particular version of white supremacy. Replacement theory says that the Western elites have conspired with the Jewish population to replace whites. It is a theory that emerged in French racial nationalism in the 1900s by a man called Ronald Camus. 2011, there was a novel called Great Replacement, which then became very popular. The results of this replacement theory is not now a group of people just quietly sitting down by themselves and stewing and say we are going to be replaced. The results of this is violence. From Pittsburgh Jewish synagogue in 2018 to what happened in El Paso in Walmart the year after, when 23 persons were murdered in what was supposed to be the Hispanic invasion, to the most recent incident in Buffalo, where 10 African Americans were murdered. This particular latest version of replacement theory has a long history in relationship to black people, as we can remember things like the KKK. So the question of white supremacy is not just about an ideology or a set of conspiracy, but really it is an ideology, quite frankly, about death. It opens up and lays the ground for perpetual violence, for a certain kind of anti-black, anti-people of color violence. And therefore, what we want to, I think, understand is that there is a direct line between ideas and action, a direct line between what people think and believe and the vicious attacks that we now see on people of color all over the United States. It is from this particular perspective that I would want that we republish this report. We live in a moment in which it is not clear that the society, in fact, will become a just society. It is not clear at this particular moment where we will end up when we think about the moment we live in. This report, however, hopefully will play a small part in making it plain the deep connections of history to the present, will make clear how history is carried out in our bones, how the ideas of white supremacy formed in the crucibles of racial slavery and of secular colonialism, not just in this country but in elsewhere, how those ideas have impact upon us today, structure the lives of many people, and then structure not just the lives in terms of structural racism, but structures the beliefs of people who will then enact violence. To come back to Jimmy, the ways in which we think about, ways in which history is carried in our bones. And only Jimmy could put it like that, carried in our bones, and how that carrying over actually shapes our particular perspective. And so for us at the center and for this report, the writing of this and publishing of this report is again calling upon us all to confront that history. To confront that history not as prologue, but as a structural element of our present society. Thanks very much.
Can you all hear me from, no, is this on? How about now? Is that any better? I'd rather speak sitting if that's all right. It reminds me of my seminar time at Brown. I can pick this up if that's better. My seminar time at Brown, which Professor Bogues is used to giving lectures. I'm not. I'm used to being in conversation, so I hope that's all right. I drafted some remarks. I'll depart from them slightly just so that we have more time for conversation if that's acceptable to everyone here. First, congratulations to the center on its 10th anniversary, and to Tony, who, as you all know, if you've had any experience of him, is consistently prodigious. He was 17 years ago when I met him for the very first time, and he's been part of my adult life ever since, and that's been a great blessing to me, so it's equally rewarding to be sitting here with him. I thought yesterday after lunch, the center met, the External Advisory Board met to have a conversation about the center's priorities going forward, and Tony asked me what I thought was missing from the report, and far be it from me to tell him what is actually not included. But it occurred to me that the one thing that might be missing from the report was the experiences of the students, black students in particular, who were at the university at that particular time. And so if you don't mind, I'll talk a little bit about what my experiences were like at that time and why I think the report is so important to the intellectual life of Brown and frankly to all institutions to center something like it here. So I started at the university in 2005, a year before the report was released. And one of the things that's missing here is that just a month before I started, Hurricane Katrina had happened. And if you can imagine, looking back at that point, over 1,000 lives were lost. I was looking just yesterday at the statistics around those lives. 50% roughly were black, 40% were white. But if you actually looked at the population under the age of 75, over 80% were black. And so it was the kind of cataclysmic racial event that if it were to happen today, I think, there would be a much different social response given what we saw with George Floyd's murder and the aftermath of Michael Brown, but the social movements that we have today had not yet well developed. And so the loudest thing we heard was the gasp when Kanye West said that George Bush didn't care about black people. That was how the country seemed to have responded. And if you can imagine, Kanye West sounded like the most sane voice to me at that time relative to any other voice, until I got to Brown. Because at our convocation, Ruth Simmons gave her introduction. I didn't know who the president of Brown was or who Ruth Simmons was. I'm the first person in my family to go to college, and 18-year-olds don't look to who the president is of a university when deciding where to go. right? They look to see if it looks like a fun place to be, if it looks like it'll be enriching to them. So I was surprised to see, I knew that the president was black by the time I'd gotten here, and so I was surprised to see her stand there and with the sternest of intent say that the crushing indifference that was facing the country at that time would not touch this place, that we would be different. And now that I lead my own institution, I can appreciate what it meant to have the Slavery and Justice Report in place already, the process proceeding before a major racial event had taken place. So just this past week, I spoke to my staff about the incidents in Buffalo, and then of course in California, and then of course in Texas. It seems to go on and on and on. I purely did not have the words other than to say, we will do something, we will act, we will come together and figure out exactly how we ought to proceed. But imagine if institutions were already ready when things like this happen, already ready to provide students and all of us an outlet, a productive path to consider our history and what we might do in response to such racial tragedies. And that's what I came into. And I consider it one of the greatest blessings of my life. Here it was, I arrived at Brown University, not knowing much about my history other than what my family had talked about. Of course, black families talk about the history and their relationship to slavery. My family came from Alabama, but it wasn't actually a formal part of my high school education, though I'd gone to one of the best public schools in New York City. And so here I come to a university in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, and it seems to be one of the central driving, animating concerns of the place. And all of my professors, Tony was one, Jim Campbell was another, Seth Rockman was another, Trisha Rose and Corey Walker came later. All of them seemed to be centrally involved in the heart of what was happening at the university. And so when I walked into the John Hay today and it said, "You belong here," that's exactly how I felt at that time. And being a first-generation college student, I had every reason not to feel like I belonged. Those symbols and signs didn't exist at that particular moment, even though Ruth Simmons was here. But that's what I felt, because the university was taking seriously part of my history, and frankly, part of American history. And we were able to talk about that collectively together and what it meant for our democracy. And so, of course, after the report was published, there was then the consideration of what would happen with regard to the center. And that sparked a whole nother set of conversations of which we could be intimately involved. One of the things I want to underscore is that the university wasn't only talking about slavery at that point. It was talking about slavery and justice and so many other questions of vital concern to our society. Biomedical ethics is just one that sticks out to me at the moment, but there were things going on in neuroscience and computer science, all of the things that universities do. But by having the conversation about slavery, it meant that it was inviting a whole another group of people into the conversation about slavery and so many other things. And so that's one of the things that I remember most about my time at the university, that I was invited in. So looking forward, what does it mean about the release of this report? Well, Africana Studies is sort of central to the campus. It's sort of, slightly off to the side, but mostly centered. But it felt like the center of the universe to me then. And one of the things that I'm looking for now as I sit on the board is how central does the center remain to the life of Brown University? How central do we make sure as alumni and parents of alumni, how much do we make sure that the questions that Tony continues to animate remain a central part of what Brown University is? And why is this important? Just like Ruth's no longer with us in this particular place, Tony will not always be here, right? All of the energy and expertise that he brings to what he does and the sort of, vivaciousness that he continues to add to every single question will not always be with us. And so it'll ultimately be up to us to ask the question of whether or not slavery and those essential concerns in our democracy remain part of the mission of the university. And more importantly, whether or not students like me belong here. And so long as we continue to invest in the center and we invest in its questions and its mission, I have no doubt that the future generations of Brown will feel as I did, that this was an incredible place, a place where they could be launched in their careers and do really remarkable things. Thank you.
that we can start even before people get to college. And there's probably things in the works, so just kind of wondering if that could thought about.
Thanks, Ray. I think, as you know, we will end this summer, and the dates escape me now. There's too many dates. We will in the summer have, for the first time, a Black and Indigenous Institute for high school students on Brown's campus. We had 6 to 7 applications. 6 to 7. 6-7 applications. We had to choose 20, and it was remarkable applications. And even after we have chosen applications, we had parents writing us to say, my child made a mistake and forgot the date. Can she apply at this stage? We have a young scholar, Dr. Max Scott, who is Afro-Indigenous, and he is leading that process. My hope is that this particular institute will become a feature of Summer at Brown. It's a pilot this year, but I'm hoping that we will be so successful that we can convince Brown that this should be it. We also have something which I think is really remarkable. We have a K through 12, we're working with 35 teachers. Some indigenous, some African Americans, some from other places. And these 35 teachers are helping us craft a K through 12 curriculum on Black and Indigenous history and life in the entire New England area. Again, Dr. Max Scott leads that process. But the model that we have developed is that we are assigning students, both undergraduate and graduate students, to work with the teachers. And the students and undergraduates will do the research necessary for the teachers to write what they have to write. Because as you know, high school teachers don't have a lot of time to do to do a lot of the research that's necessary. So that's what we're doing, and hopefully that curriculum should be ready. We're now in 22. My hope is that at the end of 23, we would have written, the document would have been written and be ready for publication in early 24, and to be adopted in Rhode Island at least. Can't talk about the other states, but certainly for this particular state. So hope that helps you answer your question.
Hi, I'm class of 87. Thanks for being here, thanks for your scholarship, thanks for your work. You mentioned that slaves built University Hall, and I wanted to know if the slaves had participated in the daily life of the university and students at the beginning, beyond building the building.
Unlike Harvard and Georgetown, what we know now, and I would say, I emphasize now, is that we know that James Manning who was one of the presidents, and when he came, he had a couple of slaves and he freed them, and he had one slave, one person who he then said was indentured, who lived on campus with him. That person is buried up in North Providence. We don't know of, and I say at this moment, of any slaves being on campus and being part of campus life. What we are aware of is that there was both indigenous labor and African slave labor who were used to build particular University Hall. It's from all the records we have seen, they were contracted. So in other words, that the people who were building the structures, some gave money and some said, okay, use my African slave or the indigenous slave to help build the hall. That's what we know, and that's what the records show us. But I want to emphasize it's now, right? Because there is, particularly led by a student group that asked for reparations. And we had a conference about that about 3 weeks ago. There is a growing feeling from students that we need to find out the names of all the indigenous and Africans who built it, who built at the University Hall, so that those names can be memorialized. And this is something we at the center are trying to think about. But the records don't really, the initial records don't really show names. They just show slave of or indentured servant of, But it means going back to find the records of those persons to see what slaves they had, and if they had any records that then said, I gave to Rhode Island, what was then called Rhode Island College. I gave to Rhode Island, to so and so, Tom or whoever, to as his for them to build to work on the building. So that's my response. But I think it's safe to say we don't have slaves on campus in the way that Georgetown had, or in the way that Harvard I know had. The only thing I would say that is connected to slavery is this, and this is something that we haven't followed up, but the evidence is there, I think, is that the Civil War split this campus right in the middle. And the question is, who went to fight in the South and who remained and fought in the North? And we have a plaque there about George Washington staying here and so on, if you remember, right on University Hall. But I've always been interested in who were the persons, because the folks who went to fight in the South went into positions of high-ranking soldiers, given the families where that they were from and how they came to Brown. And so were the persons from the North. So I just, to me, it has always been fascinating to find that out as part of the history of this place.
I was struck in with Mr. Brooks' remarks that what he had described going through, kind of trying to catch up to what was going on in this university when he was initially a freshman. And what I was struck was the alumni, by and large, that graduated long before the report was published and the center was formed, have had to go through a similar process that you did. I graduated many years before the report came. And when I first heard about it, I felt shame that, I had a lot of pride feeling I was part of this great institution. And then this report came out to attach my alma mater with slavery, and it was like, I didn't want to believe that. It was, I pushed it away, and I think how many thousands of alumni may have similar experiences that I had. And what makes the center so important is that the center is a bridge between where the university is now and reconciling itself to its history with slavery, and where we need to learn as alumni what's this all about and why it's so important to face this. And I'm just glad that, you described your experience as a student, and that's certainly where a lot of alumni
if I could, I would just add to that experience maybe the recognition that as I was trying to make the point, it was an invitation in for me, and I think for a number of people to see that history recognized so blatantly without me having to ever ask the question, that it was already on display and ready to go. And I really think that if there's any lesson to be drawn from this, the one that I've taken is trying to be ready and be prepared, asking ourselves what are the projects that we can put in place prior to the next great racial cataclysm, which will come of one kind or another, that then creates an uproar and several major news stories, because people are always looking for ways to channel their energy, channel their frustrations and their rage about the state of the country with regard to racial relations. And I came to the university at a time where that process was underway, and so I immediately found an outlet for my concerns. And I think we would be a much different society if folks had immediate outlets for their concerns because there were ongoing projects. And there are several, of course, going on around the country, but asking what our relationships are to those projects, whether or not we've generated them, supported them, reinforced them, I think is key. And that's why the center is so important to me, because it is one such opportunity, especially for the alumni of this university, to consistently say when major questions come up around race and justice, period, in the society, that there's a natural place to go for your interest, for your concern, to see what projects are relevant and moving in those spaces. And so I very much hear what you're saying as an alum, sort of seeing what the history of the what the university's relationship was to slavery. But I take it as Jim does in the volume that this was a hopeful experience for me. It actually was one that was refreshing and enlightening. And it could have been brought on by any president, of course. It probably wouldn't have been. Ruth was a special kind of figure. But the combination of the folks that were present at that particular moment I take to be a really special moment in time for Brown's history, which is why I'd be interested in reflecting on those of us who were there and how it felt different to us and what we've gone on to do.
Thanks, Rakib. I think it's not going to answer Tom's question, but I think the audience should be aware that Tom Bale and Ann Coles, who sits right there, were two alums who, once the center was formed, got in touch with us and said, could we be friends of the center? And I just want to acknowledge both their work, not just in terms of donations, but in terms of actual intellectual work and enlarged in the reach of the center to many other alums. So thank you, Anne, and thank you, Tom.
And so I see the work that you're doing in trying to promulgate the information and discovery within Ohio. Have you been in contact with others, contacted you from other universities or other states to kind of help them promulgate their curriculum?
I mean, absolutely. There are numerous invitations, and they come. They are so numerous. I have to say I can't do many of them. Huh? Yeah. But one of the things that has happened is that there is something called the Universities Against Slavery, which we are a part of, and their head office is at the University of Virginia. And we are in touch, and we kind of work with each other about, okay, this university is now trying to do this, who can help, because you need to have that network. You can't just rely on Brown, even though we were the pioneers, to go to every single place for this to happen, for this kind of experience to be told to folks and so on. So I think that that is a network, yes, which we are part of, and that network functions in that way. And we meet regularly to discuss, the new ones that want to come on and how we can help and so on. So that's my response to you. There are other, we are also very importantly, I think, recognized internationally. So the University of Glasgow, for example, wanted to do something, and they invited us to come, and we went there. We spent I think we spent about 3-4 days. They now have a center. They're about to set up a center. Next week, I will attend an invitation from the University of London, who wants to set up a similar center. And their center they want to set up is called the Center for Historical Research in Race and Slavery. And so we will meet with I will meet with the key administrators and with faculty for a couple of days to go through the experience. So that we have, we get invitations from all over around what it is that we, about this particular work that we have done. What is interesting is that we used to get invitations about the report and how to write the report. We now get invitations, I noticed a slight shift about the center and the work of the center. And what can you, how do you navigate it? How do you navigate it on a campus? What do you do? That sort of thing. Now, every experience is different, quite frankly, because every university is different in many ways. But I think there are some key things that, we have lessons that we have learned that hopefully we can pass on to people.
Hi, I have a question following up on the question about sharing this type of project with universities. I'm interested in drilling down to the community level. I live in a New England community that was inhabited by the Wampanoag people, and later in the mid-1800s was a center of shipbuilding. Many of those ships were then deployed and carried enslaved people from Africa to this country. And we have a wonderful historical society in town, but that part of our history has very much been neglected. And the story is usually, well, there are no records. The records didn't survive, or there never were records. And I'm curious what you would recommend for smaller communities around the country, especially in New England, to be able to tap into resources, to be able to find scholars who might be interested in exploring our histories and bringing them to light.
Yeah, that's a good question. One of the things that we are trying to do is, and we have this gathering on the 14th and the 15th of July, is that we are trying to identify in the entire New England region community historians. That is folks who are not necessarily recognized by the conventional historical profession, but folks who are very rooted in a community and who know the history of that community, who have access to family records, part of the time family photographs, but also particularly for indigenous people who have oral histories. And so part of what we are trying to do is to gather those folks, to talk to them about precisely what you are saying, and to then ask the question, how can this center work with you in doing whatever you think you need to do? I can't tell you what will happen coming out of that. If there are alums who are interested in helping us support that effort, please do. Right? I have to say that because I'm also always thinking about these things. But it is. What you say is really important. And so for us, from the center, what we try and do is high schools, for sure, because there's a structure there that we can work with. For communities, we have now embarked on, okay, how do we work with communities? But particularly with communities that have historians and ordinary and people who know the history of the place, but who have never been recognized. So it is, that's our next step. We did about 5 years ago something with a really incredible project with a very incredible person. Her name is Ann Chin, who had something called a Port Marcus project, which was national, in which what she was trying to do was to get everywhere where the slaves landed and lived marked as this is the place where they landed or this is the place where they lived. And we took it on for Rhode Island. And we had communities that were, that were involved, and it was a community project. It ran into a sort of community difficulties because of different factions in communities. And quite frankly, for us, we can't be involved in those factions. And so I think that some communities did things, and some communities, because of differences between people, did not do things. So what we are now trying to do is a different way. Okay, who are the community historians who we can now work with, and what do we need to do to help them? So if you could talk to me about your, right after, or to Ms. Weinberg there, who's sitting at the back, about your community, we will try and see what it is we can do. All right, thank you.
So we're unfortunately at time. This has obviously been an incredibly rich topic and goes on. One of the things I think about Brown is that we don't just think about things and write about them, but Brown is a place that where academic work of the highest caliber leads to action, and I think we've seen and heard quite a bit about that in ways that are immeasurably impactful. So in drawing the proceedings to a close, regrettably but necessarily, I'd like to thank both Tony and Rakeem for their incredible work and their time here this morning. And to all reunion returnees, to parents, and everybody else, congratulations and have a wonderful weekend on campus. It is truly a special time. Thank you.